All right, so today we're going to dive into something pretty fascinating, the world of strategy.
Ooh, strategy.
And not just talking military maneuvers here, though
Yeah.
we'll definitely touch on those.
Okay.
But you actually sent us these excerpts from Robert Greene's The 33 Strategies of War.
Okay.
So we're going to see how those principles can apply to, like, your everyday life.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how these ideas drawn from battles and, ancient thinkers
Yeah.
still resonate today. I mean, we're talking about human psychology, power dynamics,
Yeah.
things that haven't really changed all that much over time.
Exactly. I mean, Sun Tzu, Machiavelli, and
Mm-hmm.
these guys knew what they were talking about.
Yeah.
And I bet you are interested in getting ahead in like your own battles, right?
Absolutely.
Whether it's at work, in relationships, or just understanding the world better.
For sure.
So Green doesn't waste any time. His first strategy is declare war on your enemies. Now, before you start thinking you need to go pick a fight with, like, your neighbor, it's not about being aggressive for the sake of it. That's right. It's about clarity
Right.
and using that to propel yourself forward.
It's really interesting here, the concept of polarity. Green argues that having a defined enemy, even if it's a metaphorical one, can help you find, your own direction.
Right.
It gives you something to push back against, to define yourself in opposition to.
It's like that classic yin and yang single. You can't have one without the other.
Exactly.
And to, like, really bring this idea to life, Green talks about Miyamoto Musashi,
Mm-hmm.
the legendary Japanese swordsman. He was a master strategist in how he approached every duel.
Yeah, Musashi was known for adapting his fighting style to each opponent.
Right.
He never fell into predictable patterns because he saw each enemy as a unique challenge,
Mm-hmm.
a puzzle to solve.
So how can we apply this to, say, a career change?
Okay.
Let's say you've been stuck in a job you hate for years.
Right.
Maybe the enemy in this situation is complacency
Okay.
or the fear of failure. By declaring war on that fear, you force yourself to, like, take action,
Mm.
break out of that rut.
Yeah.
It's about identifying what's holding you back and then actively pushing against it.
And remember, the enemy can also be like an outdated version of yourself.
Oh, interesting.
Like maybe you used to be afraid of public speaking, but now you're actively working on it, pushing against that old limitation.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
It's all about being present and adaptable, not letting past fears dictate your future.
Okay, so we've declared war on what's holding us back. But Green's next strategy is all about choosing your battles wisely.
Okay.
The perfect economy strategy. It's about realizing that not every fight is worth your time and energy.
Exactly, because even when you win a conflict, there's always a cost.
Mm-hmm.
Wasted time, damaged relationships, maybe even creating resentment that comes back to bite you later.
Right.
Yeah.
Green gives the example of Queen Elizabeth I.
Okay.
She was no pacifist, but she was incredibly strategic about avoiding those costly wars in Europe. While other nations were exhausting themselves in constant battles, she focused on strengthening England's economy and navy. She chose a different path to power, realizing that sometimes building strength in the shadows
Mm-hmm.
can be more effective than direct confrontation.
So let's say you're in a really toxic work environment.
Yeah.
Every day feels like a battle.
Right.
Maybe the perfect economy strategy here would be to focus your energy on finding a new job rather than wasting your time trying to change a broken system.
Yeah, it's about being mindful of where you invest your energy. Sometimes, strategically retreating from a losing battle is the smartest move you can make.
Okay, this next one is a bit more mischievous.
Okay.
Green calls it disguising your aggression.
Uh-huh.
It's about recognizing that not every battle needs to be fought head-on.
Right?
Sometimes subtlety and misdirection are more effective.
Think of it as psychological warfare,
Mhm.
where you're using perception to your advantage.
Green talks about making your moves ambiguous,
Okay.
blurring the lines between fact and fiction to keep your opponents guessing.
Napoleon was a master of this.
Oh.
At the Battle of Austerlitz, he deliberately made his army look weak
Wow.
and disorganized to lure the enemy into a trap.
Oh,
They thought they had him on the ropes, but he was playing them the whole time.
that's brilliant.
Yeah.
And Green also mentions Themistocles at the Battle of Salamis.
Okay.
He sent the Persians a fake message,
Wow.
claiming he was switching sides,
Mm.
playing right into their ambitions.
And it worked.
Yeah.
The Persians fell for the deception, giving the Greeks the tactical advantage they needed to win.
Okay, but how does this translate to everyday life? It's
Oh.
not like we're going around setting up elaborate battlefield traps.
Right, but think about a negotiation, for example. Let's say you're trying to get a better deal on a car.
Okay?
You don't have to be aggressive or confrontational,
Right.
you can subtly steer the conversation, highlight the car's flaws
Okay.
in a way that benefits you, and maybe even express slight disinterest
Okay.
to make the seller more eager to make a deal.
So it's about being strategic and playful, not being ruthless or cutthroat.
Exactly. Disguising your aggression is about using perception to your advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Not being manipulative for the sake of it. It's about understanding that how things appear can be just as important as how they actually are.
Okay, let's shift gears to a strategy that's all about speed and decisiveness. Overwhelm resistance with speed and suddenness, also known as the Blitzkrieg strategy.
Yeah, the key here is to strike swiftly and decisively before your opponent can even react.
Right.
It's about creating momentum and throwing them off balance.
Think of the German invasion through the Ardennes forest in World War II.
Okay, yeah.
No one thought they could move tanks through such dense terrain, so it was lightly defended.
And that's precisely what made it so effective. The Germans exploited that weakness and achieved a major victory through sheer speed and surprise.
Now, obviously, we're not talking about like literal tanks and invasions here,
Right.
but how can we apply this Blitzkrieg mindset to, say, starting a new business venture?
It's about taking action, even before you feel totally ready.
Okay.
That initial burst of energy, that willingness to jump in and figure things out as you go, can be incredibly powerful.
So instead of getting bogged down in like planning and preparation,
Yeah.
maybe it's better to launch that website, send out those proposals, and start building momentum.
Exactly. Because sometimes action creates its own clarity and opportunities that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. It's like that old saying, a body in motion stays in motion. That initial push can be enough to break through the inertia.
And Green doesn't shy away from the more morally complex strategies either. He talks about moral warfare, which isn't necessarily about like being ethical.
Right.
It's about using moral arguments as weapons to sway people to your side.
It's about recognizing that appearances matter. Framing your actions as morally justified can weaken your opponent's resolve and even sway public opinion, regardless of the reality.
Okay. So it's kind of like propaganda, using moral high ground as a strategic advantage.
That's a good way to put it. Green brings up the fascinating story of Hassani Saba, founder of the Assassins. Now, they were a feared group, but their actual numbers were relatively small.
Wait, I thought the assassins were like this massive army.
Not quite. Hassani Saba understood the power of perception. He used targeted killings and like a campaign of fear to create this illusion of being everywhere, wielding influence far beyond their actual strength.
So it was about psychological warfare,
Yeah.
making people believe they were more powerful than they really were.
Exactly. It was about controlling the narrative, using fear and the appearance of moral righteousness to achieve their goals.
That's a bit unsettling, honestly. But, I mean, for the average person, it's a good reminder that not every moral crusade is as pure as it seems. There might be some strategic motives at play.
Absolutely. Being aware of how moral narratives are used, especially in today's world of social media and instant information, is crucial for making informed decisions.
Okay, so now let's talk about dealing with those pesky rivals and frenemies. Green has a strategy for that, too. The art of one-upmanship. It's about using psychology and strategy to get the upper hand without resorting to direct conflict.
Yeah, the key is to outmaneuver your opponent, to bait them into overreacting or making mistakes that damage their own position.
It's like that saying, don't wrestle with a pig. You both get dirty, but the pig likes it. Green shares this hilarious anecdote about the Bishop of Noyon, who was known for his vanity and pompous speeches.
Ah, yes, the poor bishop. An abbé named de Caumartin saw this weakness and crafted a plan. He wrote a speech in perfect imitation of the bishop's, overblown style, full of ridiculous metaphors and self-praise.
Wait, so he basically wrote like a parody of the bishop's own writing?
Precisely. And he cleverly showed it to the bishop beforehand, pretending it was a tribute. Of course, the bishop, blinded by vanity, loved it, and even added more of his own pompous flourishes.
Oh no, I can see where this is going.
Well, when de Caumartin delivered the speech at the bishop's inauguration, the entire court erupted in laughter. The bishop, realizing too late that he was the butt of the joke, was utterly humiliated.
So de Caumartin used the bishop's own weakness against him, achieving a social victory without ever having to directly confront him.
Exactly. And sometimes that indirect approach, that understanding of human psychology, can be far more effective than brute force.
It's almost like mental jujitsu, using your opponent's own momentum against them. Now this brings us to another important concept from Green, mental warfare. It's about recognizing that every conflict has a psychological dimension. And often that's where the real battle is won or lost.
Absolutely. It's about controlling your own emotions, staying calm and rational, even when things get heated.
That's easier said than done, though, right? Especially when someone's pushing your buttons.
It is a skill that needs to be cultivated. Green talks about the importance of what he calls presence of mind. It's about being fully present and aware in the moment, not letting your emotions cloud your judgment.
So it's about not reacting impulsively, taking a moment to assess the situation before you respond.
Exactly. Green points out that fear and anxiety can make us overly cautious, leading to missed opportunities. He gives the example of a tea master who is challenged to a duel by a samurai.
Wow. A tea master versus a samurai,
Huh.
that's not exactly a fair fight.
Right. But the tea master knew that the samurai expected him to be terrified, so he went to the duel with complete composure, acting as if it were just another day.
So he projected confidence even though he was probably freaking out inside.
Precisely. And the samurai was so thrown off by this that he assumed the tea master must be some kind of secret martial arts expert. He ended up apologizing and backing down without a fight.
That's amazing. It's like he used psychology to win the duel before it even started.
Exactly. It's a reminder that sometimes projecting confidence, even if you don't entirely feel it, can be enough to disarm your opponent.
So should we all be taking up meditation or something to prepare for our next big meeting?
Well, mindfulness definitely helps. But the bigger point is about understanding the power of perception. Sometimes appearing calm and collected, even when you're feeling pressure, can give you the edge you need.
Fake it till you make it. Right.
Mm.
But Green also talks about mastering your fears, not just pretending they don't exist.
He says those who've never lost their composure haven't learned how to regain it.
So it's about embracing those challenging moments, those times when we feel off balance, as opportunities to learn and grow.
Exactly. Green uses examples of great generals throughout history, Julius Caesar, Patton, who all had moments of doubt and fear, but they learned from those experiences and became stronger leaders as a result.
It's not about being fearless, but about knowing how to manage those fears
Mm.
and use them to your advantage.
That's a great way to put it. And part of mastering those fears is knowing when to take action, even when you don't feel fully prepared. Green calls this crossing the Rubicon.
Like Caesar crossing the Rubicon River, defying the Roman Senate, and marching on Rome.
Exactly. He argues that sometimes it's better to act before you think you're ready. This forces you to be resourceful. Think on your feet.
Because once you've committed yourself, there's no going back. You have to make it work.
Right. And that pressure can actually spark your creativity and lead to breakthroughs. So are there any Rubicons you need to cross in your own life?
That's a great question to consider. What about when it comes to working with other people? Green also emphasizes the importance of team warfare, which is more than just having people on your side.
It's about building a cohesive unit that shares your vision and can execute it effectively. He uses the example of General George Marshall, who transformed the U.S. Army from a small peacetime force into a massive fighting machine during World War II.
That's a monumental task.
Yeah.
How did he even begin to tackle that?
Marshall understood that he couldn't do it alone. He needed to build a strong chain of command, empower his subordinates, and foster a sense of camaraderie and shared purpose within the Army.
So it wasn't just about giving orders, it was about creating a culture where everyone was working towards the same goal.
Exactly. He streamlined the organization, cut out bureaucracy, and focused everyone on the mission at hand. And the results speak for themselves. The U.S. Army became a powerhouse during the war.
This concept of what Green calls remote control, building a team that can execute your vision without needing constant micromanagement, that's crucial for anyone in a leadership position, right?
Absolutely. Think about it. Are you effectively leading your team, or are you getting bogged down in the details? Are you empowering them, or are you stifling their initiative?
It's about finding that balance between control and autonomy, trusting your team to do their best work.
Green also emphasizes choosing the right people for your team in the first place. People who share your values and can think independently.
Because even the best leader can only achieve so much without a strong team to support them.
He uses the example of Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, LBJ was a complex figure, but he was a master at building and managing teams. He was demanding, but he also inspired loyalty and motivated his staff to work tirelessly.
So it was a combination of high expectations and recognizing their hard work.
He knew how to get the best out of people, and he had a core group of aides who followed him throughout his career because they believed in his vision and knew they were valued.
For our listeners out there, it's a reminder that cultivating those strong relationships, building a team you trust and who trust you, is one of the most important things you can do.
Because ultimately, you can achieve far more with a strong team than you ever could alone.
We've talked a lot about confrontation so far, but Green also highlights the importance of choosing the indirect path. This is about recognizing that sometimes the most obvious solution isn't the most effective one.
Think of it as finding a side door when the front entrance is heavily guarded. It's about being creative and adaptable in your approach to challenges.
That makes me think of T.E. Lawrence,
Mm-hmm.
Lawrence of Arabia. He knew that the Arabs couldn't defeat the Ottoman Empire head-on, so he adopted guerrilla warfare tactics.
Exactly. Lawrence used the vastness of the desert to his advantage. He would strike quickly, disappear, and keep the Ottomans constantly guessing.
So it was about wearing them down through a series of smaller strategic maneuvers, rather than one big confrontation.
Precisely. And in your own life, it might mean finding an unconventional solution to a problem, networking your way around a roadblock, or even using humor to disarm a difficult person.
It's about being resourceful and thinking outside the box. Now, speaking of outmaneuvering opponents, Green also talks about maneuvering the enemy into weakness.
This is about using strategy to create a situation where your opponent has no good options. It's like setting a trap, but instead of physical force, you're using psychology and planning to lure them into a disadvantageous position.
Napoleon was a master of this, right?
Absolutely, he'd spread his forces out in a seemingly chaotic way, confusing the enemy commander. One great example is the Battle of Ulm in 1805. The Austrian commander, General Mack, had no idea what Napoleon was up to.
So Mack was frozen by indecision, unable to plan effectively.
Exactly, and that hesitation proved fatal. Napoleon encircled Mack's army and forced him to surrender without a major battle.
Wow, so it was a psychological victory as much as a military one.
Precisely. Napoleon understood that creating uncertainty and doubt in his opponent's mind could be just as powerful as cannons and cavalry.
It's like playing mental chess, setting your opponent up for failure without them even realizing it.
And these principles can apply to so many situations: negotiations, arguments, even just trying to get your point across in a meeting, sometimes subtly guiding the conversation, planting seeds of doubt, or highlighting the weaknesses of the opposing argument can be far more effective than direct confrontation.
It's about being strategic and thoughtful, not just reactive.
Right. Instead of charging in head first, take a moment to analyze the situation, anticipate your opponent's moves, and look for those subtle ways to steer things in your favor.
Okay, now this next one seems a bit Machiavellian. Green talks about exploiting the weaknesses of the group. And this is about turning people against each other?
Not necessarily in a malicious way, but it is about understanding group dynamics and how easily they can be manipulated. Green points out that groups are susceptible to certain pressures and vulnerabilities. A skilled strategist can exploit these to their advantage.
So it's about finding those pressure points, those cracks in the group's armor where they're most susceptible to influence.
Precisely. Even the most powerful groups can be brought down by internal divisions and discontent. Look at the Roman Empire. Despite its vast power and resources, it was ultimately weakened by infighting and factionalism.
The classic divide and conquer strategy.
Mhm.
But how does this apply to, say, a workplace environment? I'm not trying to start a civil war in the office.
Of course not. But let's say there's a project where different teams are competing for resources. Understanding the individual motivations and anxieties of each team, and maybe subtly highlighting those differences, could subtly shift the balance of power in your favor.
So it's not about creating conflict out of nowhere, but rather being aware of existing tensions and using them strategically.
Exactly. And remember, Green is writing about strategy. It's up to the individual to decide how they want to apply these principles.
Right. It's a toolkit, not a rule book. And knowing how these tactics work can help us defend against them as well.
Absolutely. It's about being aware of the game so you don't get played. Now, this next strategy gets a little more intense. Green calls it hitting them way it hurts.
Okay, that does sound a bit violent. Are we talking about actual physical attacks here?
No, not at all. It's about finding your opponent's Achilles heel, their point of vulnerability. It's about understanding their psychology, their fears, their insecurities, and then using that knowledge to your advantage.
It's like the story of David and Goliath. David, the shepherd boy, was no match for the giant Goliath in terms of strength, but he saw Goliath's arrogance, his overconfidence, and used that against him.
Exactly. David chose the indirect path, avoiding a head-on confrontation. Instead, he found Goliath's weak spot and exploited it brilliantly.
So it's about being strategic and understanding that sometimes a more indirect approach, targeting your opponent's vulnerabilities, can be far more effective.
Think of it like this. If you're trying to convince your boss to approve a new project, instead of just focusing on the technical details, maybe you also appeal to their desire for innovation or their fear of falling behind the competition.
It's about knowing your audience, understanding what motivates them, and then tailoring your approach accordingly.
Exactly. And it's not just about finding your opponent's weaknesses, it's also about protecting your own.
Right. Defense is just as important as offense.
Green calls this creating a defensive posture. It's about making yourself a difficult target for your opponents, not being passive or hiding, but making yourself less vulnerable to attack.
He uses Queen Elizabeth I as an example again. She avoided costly wars, focusing instead on strengthening England's internal defenses.
Exactly. She built up the navy, fortified ports, and created a strong intelligence network. England became a very difficult target for its enemies.
So for our listener, this might mean investing in their skills, building a strong professional network, or simply being more aware of potential risks in their field.
It's about being proactive and having a plan in place so you're not caught off guard.
And sometimes, even with the best defenses, you need to know when to retreat. That's another key strategy Green discusses.
Knowing when to retreat can be tough. It goes against our natural instinct to fight back, especially when we feel attacked or threatened.
But there are times when it's the smartest move, right? Like if you're facing a much stronger opponent, or the odds are just stacked against you.
Exactly. Think about the Chinese Communist Party's Long March in the 1930s. They were vastly outnumbered and outgunned by the Nationalist Army.
The Long March was an incredible story of survival. Tell us more about it.
Well, the communists realized they couldn't win a conventional war, so they chose to retreat. They marched thousands of miles, facing incredible hardships. But that strategic retreat ultimately allowed them to survive and regroup.
So it wasn't about giving up. It was about choosing survival over a hopeless battle.
Exactly. And sometimes in our own lives, we need to recognize when a situation is no longer serving us. Maybe it's a toxic relationship, a dead-end job, or a project that's gone off the rails. Knowing when to cut your losses and move on can be incredibly powerful.
It's about choosing your battles wisely and conserving your energy for the fights that really matter. Now, this next one sounds a bit like mind control, controlling the dynamic. Is Green suggesting we become Jedi Masters?
Well, maybe not quite, but it is about using psychology and strategy to influence your opponent's thinking and actions. It's about setting the terms of engagement, dictating the pace and direction of the conflict.
So it's about being proactive, not just reacting to whatever your opponent throws at you.
Exactly. Green uses the example of Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, a brilliant German general in World War II. He was known for keeping his enemies off balance. They were always reacting to his moves.
He was always one step ahead, like he was playing mental chess.
Precisely. He'd use feints, diversions, sudden attacks to keep his opponents guessing and prevent them from developing their own strategies. And this concept of controlling the dynamic can be applied in all sorts of situations.
So whether you're negotiating a raise, leading a team, or even just having a difficult conversation with a family member, being assertive and setting the tone can make a big difference.
It's about shaping the battlefield to your advantage, even if that battlefield is a conference room or a dining room table.
Okay, this is all making me feel like I need to step up my strategy game.
That's the spirit. And Green has plenty more insights to share. He talks about disrupting the enemy's patterns, which is about recognizing how your opponent thinks and acts, and then using that knowledge to throw them off their game.
So it's about finding those predictable routines and then disrupting them.
Exactly. He uses the example of William Tecumseh Sherman, a Union general in the American Civil War. He was known for his March to the Sea, a devastating campaign through the South.
Sherman was a controversial figure, but undeniably a brilliant strategist.
He would feint in one direction, then suddenly attack from another. He kept the Confederates constantly off balance and demoralized.
That's like psychological warfare,
Yeah.
making them doubt their own abilities.
And this principle applies beyond the battlefield, whether it's business, politics, or even sports. Being unpredictable and keeping your opponent guessing can be a major advantage.
So it's not about being erratic for the sake of it, but rather using calculated unpredictability to disrupt your opponent's rhythm.
Exactly. It's about throwing them off their game.
Okay, I'm feeling more and more like a strategic mastermind. What else do we have in our arsenal?
Well, let's talk about a classic tactic in warfare: deception. Green calls the strategy using deception to gain an advantage. It's about making your opponent believe something that's not true.
Think Trojan horse.
Exactly. Green argues that deception is an essential tool for any strategist, whether it's spreading misinformation, creating diversions, or simply disguising your true intentions.
But it's important to be ethical, right? We're not condoning lying or cheating here.
Absolutely. Deception is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or for ill, but understanding how it works is crucial for anyone who wants to be strategically savvy.
So it's about recognizing when others might be using deception against us and not falling for those tricks.
Exactly. It's about being aware of the game so you don't get played. Now, another powerful strategy Green discusses is isolating the enemy. It's about recognizing that a divided enemy is a weaker enemy.
So it's about breaking up their alliances, turning their friends against them.
Not always in such a dramatic way. It's about strategically weakening their support system. Green uses the example of the Peloponnesian War in ancient Greece. The Athenians were able to defeat the Spartans in part by isolating them from their allies.
That war was brutal and went on for decades.
Exactly. And the Athenians were masters at playing the political game, forging and breaking alliances to suit their needs.
It sounds like a political chess match, using strategy and diplomacy to shift the balance of power.
And these ideas can be applied in our own lives as well. Let's say you're trying to push for a new initiative at work, but you're facing resistance. Maybe instead of directly confronting your opponents, you focus on building relationships with their allies, swaying opinions in your favor, and slowly isolating your opposition.
It's a more subtle approach, but sometimes those subtle maneuvers can be more effective than a head-on confrontation.
Right. It's about understanding the power dynamics and using them to your advantage.
This is fascinating. What other psychological strategies does Green have up his sleeve?
Well, he talks about attacking the mind. Now, this isn't about actual physical attacks, but rather about undermining your opponent's confidence, making them doubt their own abilities.
So it's about getting inside their heads, making them question their own judgment and strength.
Precisely. Green points to Genghis Khan, the Mongol conqueror, as a master of psychological warfare. He would spread exaggerated stories of his brutality, demoralizing his enemies before a battle even began.
It's about creating that mental advantage, making your opponent feel defeated before they even start.
Exactly. And this concept applies in everyday situations as well. If you can make your opponent doubt their own skills or expertise, you've already gained a significant advantage.
Wow, it really is a mental martial art.
Yeah.
What's the final strategy in Green's arsenal?
Well, this one's a bit intense, creating a climate of fear. Green argues that fear is a powerful weapon, and that a skilled strategist can use it to control and manipulate their opponents.
So it's about making your enemies too afraid to act, too afraid to oppose you.
Exactly. He uses the example of the Assassins, the medieval sect known for their targeted killings. They were legendary for their ruthlessness and their ability to inspire terror.
They were like shadows, striking fear into the hearts of their enemies.
They cultivated an atmosphere of paranoia, making their enemies believe they could be attacked anywhere, at any time. And this fear paralyzed their opponents, making them hesitate to act even if they were more powerful.
That's a powerful example of how fear can be used as a weapon.
Yeah.
But it's also a bit disturbing, right?
It is. But understanding how fear works and how it can be used against us is essential for anyone who wants to be strategically savvy.
Absolutely. It's about knowing how to defend yourself against those who would use fear to manipulate and control you.
Exactly. It's about taking back control of your own mind and not letting fear dictate your actions.
Man, we really went deep on Robert Greene today, huh? From like declaring war on your enemies to picking your battles, disguising your aggression, overwhelming resistance with speed, even using moral warfare. It's been a heck of a journey.
It really has. What I find so compelling is how Green takes these ideas from military history and applies them to everyday life. Like whether we're talking about navigating relationships, work challenges, or even those internal struggles we all face, this stuff is insightful.
Yeah, it's like he's giving us this secret decoder ring for human behavior.
Totally.
You start seeing these power plays and strategies everywhere.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that life, in many ways, is a game of strategy, and Green just gives us the framework for understanding the rules of that game.
So as I wrap up this deep dive, what stood out to you most from all these strategies? Was there one that particularly resonated or made you think differently?
That's a great question for the listeners out there to consider. And how can you apply these insights to your own goals, whatever those may be? What battles do you need to fight? Which ones are better left alone? These are all questions worth pondering as you move forward. Green says that connecting your ideas to action is what makes strategy a lifelong challenge and a source of constant pleasure. So take these strategies, explore them, adapt them, and remember, the most important battlefield is often the one inside your own mind.